All right, so now we come to chapter 21 on the Ottomans, Safavids, and Mughals. So you guys are going to be note-taking champs today, and I apologize for doing this to you, but it was really necessary to go back and cover some of that old material. All right, quick question to start. We have the Ottomans in red, we have the Safavids in green, and we have the Mughals in the lime green. A couple questions for you to think about. Which two of these three would you expect to be the most similar? Ottomans and Safavids, right? Why? Because they're right next to each other. Of course they are. How would you expect them to be similar? Culturally? Geographically? Militarily? Sahil? Okay. Social statuses or hierarchies or organization of society, all those might be the same too. You guys see this little peninsula of land here? Do you see that little peninsula of land? What do you see now? They're right next to each other. All three of them. They're stacked side by side by side. I didn't lie to you. What's that? Right, but just by looking at the geography, here you have that river, same river. Border extends, border extends. I mean, these really abut each other. That's just fun, a little fun visual thing for you. All right, here's how we're going to do this, and we'll give you a couple different tools. We're going to start with the Ottomans. Of the three empires, the Ottomans are the ones that we have the greatest detail on, and the Ottomans are the ones that you are going to need to know the most about. So to make life a little bit easier, we're going to do your notes in kind of a compare-contrast format. We're going to give you information on the Ottomans, and then we're going to compare the Ottomans to the Safavids, and then we're going to compare the Ottomans and Safavids to the Mughals. So today is going to be comparison after comparison after comparison. Again, this will hopefully allow you to write your compare-contrast essays a little bit better. And if nothing else, it should at least make your note-taking a little bit easier. Well, you are taking notes, and if you want to take notes as you normally do, you can. If you want to use this chart, you're more than welcome to as well. All right, so the Ottomans. To understand the Ottomans, we have to go back to the Abbasid Empire real quick, or at least to when the Abbasid Empire ends. By the way, who's responsible for the Abbasid Empire kind of finally collapsing? Mongols, good. So it's out of that Mongol invasion that the Ottoman Empire is allowed to begin, because it creates what we call a power vacuum. And I know we talked about this a while ago, so somebody impressed me with your long-term memory. What's a power vacuum? Farhana? Excellent. It's when there's a sudden lack of power and somebody else tries to fill it. That will always happen. If there is a lack of power, somebody else will fill it. If I walked out of the room and never came back, somewhere between 5 and 30 minutes later, one of you would act. And people would follow you because they would be comforted by the fact that finally somebody's making a decision. We're not sitting here just staring at each other anymore, wondering what to do. One of you would get up and either start clicking through the rest of the slides, or you'd be like, all right, let's go. Everybody else would be like, all right, thank God, somebody else said it first. That's a power vacuum. You're waiting for somebody else to make the decisions. The Ottomans fill that role in that part of the world. The Abbasids are gone. The Abbasids were the major political organization in that part of the world. The Abbasids controlled that part of the world. They influenced all the areas around it. And now that they're gone, all these towns and villages that used to be under their control are kind of looking around and going, all right, what do we do now? Who's going to tell us what to do? You would think it would be this wonderful moment of freedom, like, wow, there's nobody to tell us what to do anymore. Parties for everybody, parades, confetti. But then the next day it's like, all right, who's going to buy our stuff? Who's going to protect us if, bandits or barbarians invade? Who do we pay taxes to? The bridge broke. Who's going to fix it? They're looking for somebody else to fill that void. And that's what the Ottomans are able to do. Now, the Ottomans actually almost don't make it. We have the initial founder, Osman I. And it's actually through a mispronunciation of his name that Europeans come to refer to them as Ottomans. They hear Osman and they turn into Ottoman, which turns into Ottoman, and it just kind of gets distorted from there. But his son is in the process of keeping this young empire together when all of a sudden he gets invaded by a Mongol wannabe. You guys remember reading in chapter 14 on the Mongols about Tamerlane or Timur the Lame? He goes by either name. It was in like the last 4 pages of the chapter, so you may not have gotten to it. He claimed to be a descendant of the Mongols, and he was trying to recreate the Mongol Empire. And so he marched out of the central steppes of Asia, and he swept across to the Middle East. And he actually took the second Ottoman Sultan, and he threw him in this giant cage in the back of a wagon, just like destroyed the rest of the city. And then with the Ottoman Sultan in this cage in his wagon, he starts to, head back home to the Mongol steppes in Central Asia. And so it seems like this was going to be the end of the Ottomans, like, one and done. But actually the remainder of the Ottomans that had survived were able to rally together and kind of resurrect this suddenly fragile empire and turn it into something pretty amazing.
What happened to Osman's son?
Yeah, he didn't make it. But just as kind of a visual portrayal of how long-lived this empire is, this is the first ruler. This is the last. I mean, that's kind of a crazy visual timeline, isn't it? This guy was ruling Turkey in the 19-teens. So they make it from the 1300s all the way through World War I as an established empire. That's kind of cool, especially when you look at it like this and you start to see 20th century dress. I mean, the guy's got his little vest and necktie and he's smoking a cigarette. Like, those are 20th century, accoutrements that, I mean, like, we're used to studying history, so we're used to seeing, like, weird looking old people with funny hairstyles and hats and clothes and be like, yeah, all those people are old. We're not used to seeing the transition to something like this yet. Nick?
Why did the Ottomans decide to Germany in World War I?
Because it was a no-brainer. It was like looking at the, professional football playoff picture. How many people were predicting during any of those games that what appeared to be the dominant team was going to win? People figured Peyton Manning would win. People figured the 49ers would win. People figured the Packers would win. People figured the Patriots would win. How many of those are actually left standing now that we're heading into the Super Bowl? Germany at the time of World War I was the hands-down favorite. It's the most powerful military on the planet. Why wouldn't you want to be on their side? All right, we good here? Anything else you need explained? Okay. 3 groups of people you need to know in the Ottoman Empire. The first is the ruler, the sultan. Absolute power. Absolute power. Totally removed from the population most of the time. Lives in a massive palace, lots of servants, absurd wealth. Yes, ma'am.
But weren't the wazirs also like given the things like that they had power?
Well, and we're going to talk about this absolute power that the sultans have. And I know we mentioned this before, but you guys have seen Aladdin, right? Most of you. Do you remember the Sultan in Aladdin? Okay. That dude has total power. What does he do with his total power? He plays with his toys. He sits in his palace in his fancy clothes with his fancy food, and he plays with toys. And who's the one that actually makes the decisions? Right, his advisor, the court vizier, Jafar. He's the guy that's actually making legal decisions, creating laws, passing laws, throwing people in prison, confiscating magic carpets, whatever. And that's a lot of what you see in the Ottoman Empire, especially after the first couple generations of rulers. You know, kind of that same philosophy that Ibn Khaldun had about the 3 generations of empire. First one works really hard and sacrifices a lot. Second one starts to get lazy. Third one's just full-blown corrupt. And then everybody dies. Well, this one manages to hold on for 600 years. But once you got past those first couple generations of rulers, with all of the wealth available, the sultans kind of become ineffective. The viziers become incredibly powerful behind the scenes. The Janissaries are the military might of the Ottoman Empire. The Janissaries are kind of like the Ottoman special forces. Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, whatever. And what's interesting about the Janissaries is that they're actually taken from conquered areas. They are not native Turks. Most of the time, they're not even native Muslims. Instead, these are children, sometimes infants, that are taken from conquered areas, brought back to Istanbul later, and from childhood are trained to be warriors, are taught and brought up in the Muslim faith. Kind of like Spartans, yeah. Kind of like samurai in Japan. I mean, this is your calling from day one of your life. And what's really interesting is that there would be people in these conquered areas, you know, Southeast Europe, North Africa, wherever, that as the Ottomans rode through after the battles were done, there would be peasants along the roads out in the country as the Ottomans marched through victorious, and they would actually hold up their small children, begging the Ottoman generals to take their son, knowing that the Ottomans would be able to provide them with a much better life. Because these Janissaries are well fed, they're well clothed, they're given an education, they're taught to read and write, and they're taught to become elite killing machines that, if they survive, will become amazingly powerful and wealthy. But can you imagine that? Poor peasant families saying, "Here, take my child," knowing you'll probably never see them again, handing them over to the enemy in the hopes that that child might survive and prosper. Question?
Why did you give the people you conquered no power?
Well, because when you raise a child from that young, they wouldn't know anything different. And that's why they took children. You know, they're not going to conscript 30-year-old adults that might secretly betray them. You're going to take children and bring them up the way that you want them. Right. Question, Stephen? It's not quite the same thing as Hitler and the Hitler Youth, but it's that same notion of if you get the kids on your side, they will most likely grow up to be your supporters. So yeah, on a very surface level, it's the same. Does this word look familiar? Okay, that's a concept that continues into the Ottoman Empire. This notion that Jews and Christians are, equal recipients of God's word, they just got part of it wrong. So these are the four significant groups in Ottoman society. Obviously they have, a sophisticated hierarchy of upper class and middle class and lower class and all that. We're going to condense it down to just these four most basic components.
There are no peasants?
Oh, yes, there are. But we just kind of figure peasants are a given at this point. Do what? Both. Yeah, they have both. Any other questions here? Okay. These are pictures of janissaries. Take a moment and just browse through the different faces. What do you see? Some of them have white hair. We can zoom in a little bit if you want. All right, you see some different ethnicities. You see some that look definitely European. You see some that maybe look a little bit more Middle Eastern. Right, wide variety of clothing, wide variety of facial hair, facial features. James?
They all like hats.
There's a lot of different hats. Nick?
They're completely undisciplined. They're not moving in any formation whatsoever. Marching up and on.
Well, it's like a parade. Blowing trumpets and stuff. I mean, you gotta have a little fun. You can't be serious killing machines all the time. One of the highlights, both for the Janissaries and for the Ottoman Empire in general, is when they are finally able to knock off the last remnants of the Byzantine Empire. And 1453 becomes a pretty significant date in history, which is the date when the Ottomans successfully capture the city of Constantinople.
When did the Ottomans start this game?
1290s. Sahil?
But the difference of the two were that's why the Constantinople was just something
It was both.
I mean, was the Byzantines really a threat? Because that's really the Ottomans' main
The Byzantines weren't a threat to destroy the Ottomans, but they were certainly a rival. And as we've seen has been the case throughout history, oftentimes this is how people choose to deal with their rivals. Conquest and invasion and, But what's interesting about this is that despite the fact that Constantinople had become one of the holiest cities in Christendom, it's up there with Jerusalem. When the Ottomans successfully take the city and enter, the Byzantines were absolutely terrified the city was just going to be leveled, destroyed, sacked, burned to the ground. And instead what happens is that Mehmet II, who is the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire at the time, preserves it, protects it. There were actually Ottoman soldiers that raced to the Hagia Sophia, intent on looting it. And Mehmet, or so the story goes, Mehmet and some of his generals walked in and saw them doing this and had his own soldiers executed right then and there for defiling this amazing church. And then they have it restored and they convert it to a mosque, but still allow Christian worship to take place inside. Nick?
Now, excluding the Hagia Sophia and other religious sources throughout the city, didn't Mehmet also issue a order that his troops could engage in 3 days of meeting?
Yeah. And that was fairly common practice. I mean, you have to let the soldier, that's oftentimes how armies pay their soldiers, is not necessarily in daily wage, but in the promise of loot at the end of the trip. So, yeah, unfortunately that's definitely going to happen. But there were certainly parts of the city that were preserved. And you will then see, over the years, other mosques join them. And this is one of the things that makes Istanbul such a cool place today, is this fusion of European and, Asian cultures, Christian and Muslim architecture and significance. I mean, it's such an odd blending. It really does straddle the two continents. And Anna, you're going to get to see all that. You guys missed out. That's the summer trip this year. Right there. All right. What happens to the Ottomans? Well, they decline, like everybody else. So as we look at why they decline, we're actually going to make it a little bit more subjective and ask the question, did they decline because it was their own fault? Or did they decline just because that's what happens? It's unavoidable. So, reasons why it might have been an unavoidable collapse, or not really worthy of being called collapse at all. I mean, one reason is it lasts for 600 years. That's not really a collapse. We often think of collapses as sudden. This is more like a 600-year period of decay. It's not really a collapse when you look at the number of people that they had to stave off, including Russia, the Byzantines, Western Europeans like England and France, and even their neighbors like the Safavids, and they were still standing up until World War I. And as we've seen with other large empires, eventually if you get big, you're not going to be able to hang on to all that you've conquered. We saw it with the Romans, we saw it with Alexander, we saw it with the Abbasids, we saw it with the Mongols. But there were definitely some things that the Ottomans did in terms of mismanagement that caused their empire to fall because of their own mistakes. Some of these are going to be very, very, very familiar reasons. Like the first one, corrupt government, which we already touched on. Sultan has absolute power, but he uses his absolute power to take care of himself and enjoy life, and hands off a lot of his responsibilities to who? The vizier. Nick.
Why, this might be unrelated, why does Jim Law the magnificent type of George trigger?
Because it's awesome.
You really have that much hair?
I mean, if you could have a turban that size, wouldn't you wear one?
Fall over or something.
I mean, especially since it's so cold in this school, can you imagine how warm your head would be?
Yeah, but I can just see him walking, and then his top heaviness just make him fall over.
Or you get stuck going through a door? I don't know. Someday we're all going to look back and ask serious questions about why we're wearing what we're wearing today. So it could just be one of those fashion issues. Like your reading quiz talked about, the Ottomans have serious issues with succession. And there's actually a great story that will put this into stark relief for you. The guy that we were just talking about with the awesome turban, historians agree this man was a certifiable genius with an IQ well above 140. What's interesting about this is that his father, whose name was Selim the Grim, not a great nickname for dad, his father became paranoid that his children were at some point going to attempt to overthrow him. And so he engaged in, let's just call it the mass slaughter of his own children. He had all of them executed except for the one that he was pretty sure was the dumbest and therefore the least threat. And he had all the rest of them executed and put to death, and he had the one that he was convinced was already pretty stupid locked up in the harem with the women, assuming that a lifetime of growing up surrounded by girls would make his son even weaker and therefore even less of a threat, and he could rule until he was good and sick and tired of it, and at that point would never have to worry about being, overthrown by his own children. James?
How many children did the guy have?
Oh, fair number when you consider that he had multiple wives, hundreds of mistresses and concubines. There were more than a couple kids.
So that would be at least how many?
More than 2.
Well, I know that.
More than 2 and less than 1,000. How about that?
Let's say like 20, 30?
Sure, that sounds good. We'll go with that. Except the one kid that he left alive was Suleiman. Because Suleiman figured out what was going on and played stupid.
But wasn't he smart?
Yes, and that's what I'm saying.
So, I'm assuming his children are all male because he wouldn't really fear a female.
Right. Right. So we're only killing off the boys. The girls aren't a threat. The girls are locked up in the harem. So Suleiman does in fact eventually overthrow and have his father killed and seize power and ushers in what we could probably call the Ottoman Renaissance. I mean, it was the height of Ottoman power and learning and wealth and trade. People from all over the world came to Istanbul to learn, to make money, to study. Suleiman himself was a philosopher, a poet, an artist, an architect. That calligraphy you see there at the bottom, that's actually his signature. But he apparently falls victim to the same paranoia as his father, and so later in his life he pursues the same course of executing his own children. There was actually a bow, bow and arrow, in the imperial armory, probably made of like gold and jewels and things like that, and the bowstring was made out of, fine Chinese silk. And it became common practice for Suleiman to be, in his palace, or if they were out on a campaign at war, in his general's tent, and he would just send for one of his sons. And the son would walk into the tent, and his janissary guards would step out and put the silk bowstring around the kid's neck and take care of him. Well, that would be inhumane. And there was a story that actually one of Suleiman's sons knew that this was going to happen. And some of the soldiers were encouraging the son to run away and raise an army and come back and take power because they liked him. And the son was like, no, I need to, this is my father. He's the sultan. If he chooses to take my life, I have to obey. And so he voluntarily walked into the tent and so Suleiman does actually preserve his dumbest son. And that's the one that takes power. He goes and loses pretty much the entire Ottoman navy in a very ill-conceived battle, which I think your book talks about, the Battle of Lepanto. And he makes a couple other dumb decisions, and then he too falls victim to the same paranoia. And so it's not like every sultan does this, but it happens, and it seriously limits the talent pool for upcoming rulers. So we got that as a problem. Lavish lifestyle, blah, blah, power hungry, blah, blah. All that should be familiar on bullet number 3. You also have a similar mindset like we saw in China, where because the Ottomans eventually became kind of the pinnacle of civilization, they got arrogant and became convinced that they were better than everybody else. And so therefore there was no reason to change. And so even when the Europeans start developing better guns and better ships, the Ottomans dismiss it. They're like, nah, their stuff can't possibly be that good. They're European. We're Ottomans. We're amazing. Nobody can compete with us. You think that long enough, you fall behind, just like China did. And they are one of the economies that falls into serious trouble because of all the silver that Spain and Portugal bring back from the New World. You know, that same problem where they have so much money they go bankrupt. So certainly plenty of blame that we can assign to the Ottomans for ruining their own empire, but also plenty of reason to look at them and be amazed and impressed that they lasted for as long as they did. All right, you ready for the condensed version of the Safavids? And again, because you have this on the website and it's recorded, if you just need to get it later, that's fine. But the quick version of the Safavids, much like the Ottomans, again, like we said, we're going to do this compare and contrast style. So like the Ottomans, the Safavids are able to start their empire thanks to the Mongols.
When did they start up?
Roughly the same time, beginning of the 14th century, early 1300s. Much like the Ottomans, this is a Muslim empire that's very militaristic. Much like the Ottomans, they will eventually decline in part because of the whole lavish lifestyle, corrupt government, blah, blah, blah. Much like the Ottomans, they have a feudal system in their society to help govern their empire. Much like the Ottomans, the rulers will lose power to their advisors. And not even so much lose as give up power. Much like the Ottomans, the Safavids will use foreign slaves as soldiers. They're not going to call them janissaries. I honestly don't know what they did call them, but they will have something very similar to the janissary model. They will use Islam to keep their empire together, just like the Ottomans. They too will trade a great deal, not just within the Middle East itself, but throughout Asia and even into Europe. You're going to see the same limitations on women that you saw in the Ottoman and earlier Abbasid empires. The practices of harems being used by the upper class men, the elites, will continue, as will the practice of women needing to be veiled and fully clothed. And you will also see episodes of paranoia from the Safavid rulers of their own children, which will oftentimes result in their deaths. So, pretty similar, right? Kind of amazingly so. There's a few significant differences, though. Like your reading quiz talked about, the Safavids were predominantly Shia, unlike the Ottomans, who were Sunni. It doesn't cause a huge difference, but the early Safavid rulers were religious leaders rather than military leaders. So that colors the character of their empire a little bit. But again, they both become so interested in expansion that their societies become fairly militaristic anyway. This is a good one for your chart. The Safavid rulers are called Shahs rather than sultans. So please be careful of trying to use the word sultan interchangeably, because you can't. Even though both empires were fairly militaristic and wanted to expand, one of the big differences is that the Safavids were never able to come close to matching the Ottoman military power. They were always that younger sibling, never quite as big, never quite as strong, never quite as powerful, always in competition, but never able to surpass the Ottomans. Kind of makes you want to go, oh. Part of that competition is probably what made the Safavids more willing to acknowledge and make use of Western ideas, trying to find whatever edge they could to compete and maybe surpass the Ottomans. What's up, Trina?
I'm thinking, this is going back
Sure.
a few things, but I'm confused about the Sufis. Like, what were they? Were they just religious leaders that followed Islam, or like
Yep.
did it fall into
Well, the Sufis were kind of the wandering mystics of the Muslim world. And so they were the people that, like, back during the Abbasid Empire, they would travel to India almost like a missionary and spread the faith as a religious leader. So that's what we mean by founded by religious leaders. It's not some general who's staking a claim to an empire. It's a religious leader who is organizing the community around him, around religious principles. Does that make sense? Okay. Another small, not really a trivial difference, but a small difference. The Safavids speak Persian. The Ottomans use Turkish. And then the last one, the Safavids just don't last as long. They're only able to stretch it until the early 1700s, whereas the Ottomans will last until 1920, more or less. Paul?
What time did they start?
They all start about the same time, 1290s, early 1300s. Now, we could ask a really generic question like, so, are they more similar or more different? But I don't know that that would give us a very definitive answer. Hopefully you can see that they do share a lot of political and military similarities. They're both Muslim empires, although obviously representing different branches. They do have a lot of the same characteristics, and so there's really just, a few details here and there that are significantly different. And just as a reminder, of the two, which one is more important for you to know? The Ottomans. All right, you ready for the Mughals in 30 seconds? Even comparing their architecture. You see the same styles, the minarets, the domes. It just looks slightly different from what we saw in Istanbul, but you can still see the cultural similarities. All right, Mughals compared to the other two together. The Mughals created an empire in India, which has had a long and rich history already. And so that's going to be one of the big things that makes the Mughals different, is that their empire is in a place where civilization has already existed for 3,000 years. And so we're actually going to focus just on the differences for right now, because the similarities I think we've already pretty much hammered home. And you can just attribute them to the Mughals as well. Well, they're actually going to go back and forth between Shah and Sultan, depending on the ruler. The Mughals get their name because they claim to be descendants of the Mongol invaders under Genghis Khan, which is probably why Mongol and Mughal sound so close together, because they're trying to preserve that legacy. They are not going to conquer in the name of Islam. Islam will be part of their empire, but what other religion is going to be part of their empire since they're in India? Hinduism. So if you were to, begin conquering India in the name of Islam, who is that really going to upset? The millions of Hindus already there. Yes.
Were they Indian, or were they?
Good question. Are they Indian? Yes-ish. Only because India has a variety of ethnic groups. And so it's not really easy to lump them all into one category and say these are Indian and the Mughals are not. The Mughals are going to be one of the more northern ethnic groups rather than one of the southern or coastal or anything like that. But these aren't, you shouldn't look at them as like some sort of invading force from far, far away. I mean, these are people from within India. So again, they're not doing this to spread their religion because they don't have a single unifying religion in India. They're pretty well split between Hinduism and Islam and even a little bit of Buddhism and Christianity. That is going to factor a lot into how the Mughal Empire is shaped. They have to keep all of these groups happy, or at least living in peace with each other, which is why one of the Mughal Shahs, I think it was a Shah that did it, maybe it was a Sultan, I forget, tries to create his own religion. He tries to create a religion that would happily blend aspects of Islam and Hinduism and Buddhism so that everybody could just belong to this one new religion and all the problems would go away. Called the Dini Ilahi. Guess how well that went over? Yeah, not good. We've talked before about how hard conversion is. But converting to a religion that your ruler just thought up yesterday, probably not going to get many people on the bandwagon. And he tried for a little bit. But he got in a lot of hot water with people because he was constantly experimenting with all different kinds of religions. He would have spiritual and religious advisors from all over the world, Jews, Christians, Muslims, Hindus, Zoroastrian, like you name it, he tried it. And he tried to throw it all together in a big pot and stir it around and Dini Ilahi. And people are like, I'm going to pass on that. What's that?
What was the Mughal time period?
Same as the others. You are going to see the roles for women go up and down a little bit in this empire. In some ways it seems like they're improving, in other ways it seems like they're not. The practice of sati, putting the widow on the funeral pyre along with her recently deceased husband, that will continue. But you will also have women that are either able to gain power or at least co-rule. Almost like Justinian and Theodora back in Byzantium. You will see a number of wives of rulers have significant influence and power in society. One of those gives rise to one of the more impressive love stories in history, which is the motive behind the construction of the Taj Mahal. Which I think we have a picture of. Yeah, that. I'll go back, don't worry. For those that haven't seen this and didn't know, this is not a palace. This is actually a tomb to the wife of one of the Shahs of the Mughal Empire. All right, that was a lot all in one day. You guys are wonderful. Next class, we're doing the essay, compare, contrast. We'll see you on Thursday.